Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the view that's widely held, and I recently read something about it, which was sort of the genesis, if you like, of this video, is that had Hitler been a little bit more clued in, more aware, more capable in the grand strategy department, that the war, World War II, could have turned out very differently. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but let's just accept on face value that that's a worthwhile assessment and see how we go. I suppose we need to look at strategy. Strategy, by its very nature, is looking into the future and considering all the possible variables of what may occur. So it's a big ask and it's a tough gig. And in grand strategic terms, I don't know if Hitler was any better or any worse than any of the other leaders of the Second World War, like Stalin or Churchill, Roosevelt, or even Truman later on, or the French leaders in the early part of the war. I don't think he was any better or any worse. In some respects, he was a little bit better, and others maybe not so much. But whether or not grand strategy is his forte is another matter. He's quite capable in the area of tactics, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But strategy is a tough gig. When you look at sort of any warfare or any of the major sort of conflagrations in military terms, at least in modern history, none of them really, or one maybe, stands out as being a successful concept of grand strategy, and that would be Britain in the 7 Years' War. That's 1756 to 1763. In this war, Britain was, remember, these are sailing ships. Britain had fleets and troops in the Caribbean, in the Americas, around India, or in various places around Europe. They were funding or paying a very large part of the Prussian military campaigns in and around Central Europe. This is the time of Frederick the Great and his rather successful, although costly, battles around. And Frederick the Great, the Prussians were fighting the Russians, the Austrians, and the French at the same time. But Britain, that was the war, the 7 Years' War, that really put Britain on the map as a world power, a serious player. Now, bear in mind, at the time, Britain had a population of 7 or 8 million. And they were fighting, a war of France that had 23 or 24 million population, and Spain that had 10 million, and so on. So this was again, in grand strategy terms, and this is the prime ministership for at least part of the war of William Pitt, but they were able to achieve a great deal all across the globe with really got quite a small amount of resources deployed relative to the cost that the British went to in that war, to the gains they made. It was and is viewed, by the way, in many quarters as a masterpiece of grand global military and economic strategy. Now, the main success that Britain had, and they had some decent military successes, but the primary success they had is that the other combatants became financially exhausted earlier on in the conflict, and the British managed to at least hold their finances together and profit from it, with vastly increasing their mercantile trading empire. So they came out of it pretty good, really, in the overall scheme of things. But aside from that, there's very few grand strategic masterpieces that you can point to anywhere. Now, if you go back in time, you can see the Romans managed to pull it off quite a few times, actually. The Greeks in some occasions there, but really the grand strategy is something that very few people can say that they were at the top of the heap. And if you look at Napoleon, in grand strategic terms, I believe that his something of a failure that he could win battles consistently. And as a generalissimo, he's almost without. Well, he's without peer in terms of his ability to win battlefield victories, and also to mobilise the resources of the nation to achieve and focus on getting those victories. But grand strategy is something that there's not many people around. I don't think Napoleon was very good at it. I think he failed on strategic terms, even though in tactical terms he was successful on many occasions, or in micro strategy, his ability to divide his enemies and defeat them in turn, this sort of thing. But in grand strategy, I don't think so. But coming back to Hitler now the big decisions that he was supposed to have made mistakes on, or stuffed them up, or fucked them up, whatever you want to call it, is the decision to invade the Soviet Union before defeating Britain, and then the strategic errors during the course of what some believe were strategic errors during the course of that 41-45 war, where the Wehrmacht was fighting the Red Army. So if you look at all those are the major ones. Now there are some sub blunders which again can be seen in strategic terms. Hitler's decision to send 250,000 of fairly decent, well-equipped troops to North Africa. The decision to then, after having lost those, send another 250,000 plus troops to Italy and Sicily to oppose the Allied landings there, the British and American forces. So these are seen as strategic blunders, maybe at a lesser level, but still blunders nonetheless. So let's compare Hitler to the others. I don't think he was any better or worse than Churchill. Now, Churchill had been a colonel in the army. He'd also seen service in South Africa, or been up close to the war in South Africa, and again during the First World War. And he fancied himself as a bit of a military expert. When you look at the decisions that Churchill made, I can't think of a decision that he made in military terms, whether it be tactical or micro-strategic or even grand strategic, that turned out very well. Most, when his advisors opposed him, he would override them. And so Churchill was certainly in grand strategy terms, I don't think he was very good at all. Now, in the wider strategic sense, he saw the threat of communism, and he saw the threat that the Russians would take over the Eastern Europe and would put puppet communist governments in there. He foresaw that, but that was hardly any stroke of genius there. Most people on the ground would have thought the same thing, that he was one of the ones that put a very public voice to it was fine, but there's hardly any original thought that went into that. So I don't see Churchill as a grand strategic genius at all. Stalin, in a different sense, Stalin had seen service as a political commissar in the Russian Civil War and also in the Polish-Russian War in 1919 to 1921, I think it was. The minute, almost the day that Poland became a nation at the end of World War I, it went to war with Russia and tried to grab an easy slice of territory, while Russia was in the Soviet Union. Communist Russia was in a state of civil war at the time. So the propaganda that the poor little defenseless Poland and evil Nazis and everything, Poland was a very aggressive, very military nation. So the idea that they were just some poor little defenseless bunch of kids is just utter crap. But nonetheless, so in grand strategic terms, Stalin had got experience as a political commissar where he had to make military decisions, I guess, or to some extent, but it's more from the political side than the purely military side. And also as a commissar, he was commissar for resourcing some of the army, so finding the weapons and so on. But again, in grand strategic terms, Stalin would just gather all the weapons from the neighborhood and kill anyone that didn't like it. So he was hardly someone who was distinctly lacking in finesse. Now, the decision Stalin made during most of the part of World War II, and from 41 to 45 or 44, really, the decisions he made were just one blunder after another, and they were mostly done on political level of pretend you're not being defeated, and then the defeat won't happen. And it was an ideological nightmare having to be a general under Stalin. Stalin, some of the generals like Tukhachevsky had tried to use tanks as a mobile striking arm in warfare. He saw that tanks could replace cavalry rather as a long range and a striking sort of force and a breakthrough force, and a mobile breakthrough force. But all these guys, Stalin had them all killed off. So in micro strategic terms and tactical terms and so on, Stalin was a disaster. So if you're looking for some sort of strategic genius out of Stalin, it's not there. Now, some say that Stalin had a strategic foresight because he thought that if he took over Eastern Europe and put puppet governments in there, that would make the Soviet Union safer from invasion and so on. I don't buy any of that, and I don't see that as any stroke of genius. Far from it. That's the tactic that nations who've got the ability to do it have been using for many hundreds of years, thousands of years. So no, I don't see that at all. If we look at say the Japanese leadership in the lead up to, say, the strike at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese leadership counted on the view that America was still in depression, that there was a lot of internal dissent and discord in America, which there was. And if the Japanese knocked out the American fleet, then the Americans would think, look, it's all too hard. What do you want? Well, we want the oil fields, we want this, we want that. Yeah, okay, you can have it. Just don't give us any more trouble. And the Japanese took the view that the Americans would sort of accept, if you like, a fait accompli there, and or if they did decide to make a struggle out of it, would find that the struggle was just so hard and difficult, with the fleet having been knocked out at Pearl Harbor, that they would come to terms within a 6 months or a year. To just not interested in taking the casualties or going through the strain of prosecuting a war across such a vast area of islands and water and so on. It was actually a reasonable gamble. I think most people in their position at the time, given the reality on the ground, would have made a similar decision and expected that sort of outcome. But the fact it didn't turn out that way was probably a bit of a surprise to them. And that the Americans would prosecute the war so vigorously and so intensely was a surprise, I'm sure. In terms of the French leadership, the political situation in France was very unstable in 1939-40. The French had almost completely lost confidence in their body politic, and justifiably so, given the carry-on at the time. There were junior generals, senior colonels or brigadier generals like, say, General de Gaulle as a case in point, that also took the view that tanks could be used offensively and as a mobile strike force. But the bottom line was France was determined to go on the defensive if there was another conflict, and tanks were used really as mobile artillery, a way of how do you get artillery from one point to another, rather than as a decisive tactical unit in its own right. So that the French weren't really looking at things, as best I can tell, in grand strategic terms. So coming back now to Hitler. Hitler had achieved a great deal politically, in Central Europe, Czechoslovakia and all that sort of thing. He'd either signed people up as allies like Hungary and Romania, or had the integration with Austria, and Austria's all German speaking, and the Sudeten area of Czechoslovakia, which again was 90% majority German, and then the absorbing the Czech and Slovak states into, I suppose, what we call the wider Reich, I guess. So the Polish issue came up when, because Poland, East Prussia had been divided up from Germany by what was called the Polish Corridor, and which is a strip of land that the League of Nations had given to Poland after World War One. Now, the Germans sought to reunite East Prussia to Germany, which was inevitably going to happen, and so they wanted to get into talks with the Polish government about that. The Polish government wasn't interested in talking about it, and so inevitably that was going to lead to some sort of conflict, which it did. Now, the non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, Communist Russia, which brought out the partition of Poland, then the Wehrmacht was incredibly successful beyond, I think, anyone's wildest dreams in defeating the French and British forces in 1940. Now, there was quite a bold plan by probably more than anything, really, General von Manstein put that together. But Hitler was approving a lot of these things. So Hitler, even though he was a corporal in the army, he'd won the Iron Cross for bravery. So he's clearly a very brave man. And they didn't hand those out to everybody. But he was only a corporal, so he wouldn't have been involved in grand strategy or even the tactics of battle and that sort of thing. But he was viewed pretty much by all commentators, even up until the 1960s. He was viewed as what was called a gifted amateur. And because he was the head of state, he was approving all these quite bold and even in tactical terms revolutionary, military tactics and plans, and the use of armor, the tanks, to strike out ahead of the infantry was in itself quite revolutionary. Even cavalry wouldn't really go that far ahead. They'd chase a defeated enemy and harass them, but in terms of a breakthrough force and operating decisively behind the lines, they could be disrupting, but decisively behind the lines, that was something that was conceptually very new, and the use of tanks and armor to do that. And the Wehrmacht had on or about the same amount of tanks as the French and the British had, and they weren't, at the time at least, significantly better. There was a lot of Panzer 1s and 2s, which were really just armoured cars. So the Panzer 3s and 4s, they weren't overly numerous. And the French, some of the Char series French tanks were probably better than that. And all of the, or nearly all of the French and British tanks had sufficient power in their cannons, the velocity and the size of the shells to take out any of the Wehrmacht tanks. So there was, as one commentator said at the time, that the British and French didn't have more tanks, or the Germans rather didn't have more tanks or even better tanks. They just used them far more effectively. And that's the case here. So, and again, Hitler approved all this, the tactics, how the tanks would be structured. When General Guderian, who was the main sponsor of this, or certainly in the later stages, along with Beck and others, would say, well, we need a radio in the tanks, and we need to be able to do this, and communications and that, and the type of shells to be carried. Hitler was approving all of this. So to say he was just an utter dunce and had no concept of the wider implications, or that he was just rubber stamping whatever the generals put in front of him, he understood it sufficiently to grasp the implications of this, not only this new technology, but how it was to be deployed on the battlefield for maximum tactical effect. So now, in terms of once the British and French had been defeated in France, there's a lot of military theorists who say that if the Germans had even made, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe had even made a decent paratroop landing, put say 20, 30,000 soldiers into Britain, they probably could have captured it. Britain was in such a state of disarray and panic, and they had hardly any soldiers. Nearly all their equipment was in France. The logistics to move things around were not good, and so it would have been easy to really finish Britain off if the Wehrmacht had decided to make a go of that. Or that's the view of many. I'm not so sure about that, but it is for historians a tantalising thought. Now, the Wehrmacht or Hitler believed that the Luftwaffe could overwhelm the Royal Air Force, and it was a very close run thing. If the Luftwaffe had kept up the pressure, they would have broken the RAF in the end. But they decided that they were taking more losses than it was worth, and Britain would surrender anyway when they realised how pointless it all was. It was also a close-run thing politically that Churchill convinced the British body politic to fight on, because there was a very large segment that wanted to reach some sort of accommodation with Hitler. Now, Hitler was interesting because he's a lower middle class, working class guy, and one thing that he was just blown away by was how the British Prime Minister, the very aristocratic Neville Chamberlain, came to see him in Munich, over the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia at the time. Now, Hitler was very surprised by this, that he would be feted and treated as an equal, as Hitler saw it at least, by the British Prime Minister. Now, this is something, Hitler had a huge admiration for Britain and the Empire, and believed that if he could be treated as an equal by those guys, something Napoleon, for example, never achieved. He was a small regional, micro aristocrat, and the European aristocracy never accepted him as an equal. They thought he was a vulgar, uncouth punk, and they would never accept him. And half the declarations of war you think happened during that time weren't because of the imposition of French, reparations and things like that, is because there's that damn middle class sort of punk hooligan Napoleon, and we're going to have him telling us we're going to kick his non-aristocratic ass around Europe. And so a lot of it was that. Now Hitler wanted to be treated as an equal and as a great man, if you like, by these aristocrats that he secretly admired and wished and wanted to be. So the view is by many that had Britain wanted to reach an accommodation with Hitler, that he would have given them extremely generous terms, left them with the empire and really not sort of pushed the point at all, and that Germany's future was in Europe, not in a worldwide trading empire or anything like that. Whether or not that had come to pass was one thing, but that again is a tantalising sort of consideration for historians. But Hitler's decision not to invade England after the Luftwaffe had failed was not unreasonable. The weather and conditions were very poor, and it would have involved a significant deployment of armed forces and resources to achieve. Now, it's again, if the Wehrmacht had stayed absolutely focused on that objective, they would have. I don't think there's any doubt they would have achieved it. But it would have taken probably another 12 months waiting for better weather conditions, that sort of thing. Now, at the time, Hitler believed that without having to fight that battle, if he knocked Russia out of the picture, the Soviet Union out of the picture, that Britain would just have to surrender by default, because there'd be nowhere to go, nothing for them to do. And the British blockade, naval blockade, to deny Germany the various resources it needs, including sort of rubber and say grain and oil and that sort of thing, that would be irrelevant if the Soviet Union was defeated and the German economy had access to all those resources of grain and oil. So Britain would be forced to come to terms simply because their blockade would be meaningless and there's nowhere else they had to go and nothing they could possibly achieve. So that was in strategic terms. I think most people would have made that same decision. And bear in mind, Hitler did have a number of fairly smart advisors. He wasn't simply just making all this up himself. This idea that he was a frothing madman and was screaming and shouting at everybody, that really didn't happen until 1943, 1944, when the war was going badly and he was trying to make all the decisions, and the stress and the strain did drive him crazy from time to time. But back then, when things were going well, he was hardly difficult to get on with, and based on, say, the observations of Albert Speer, or Albert Speer in German, then he was behaving pretty much as any head of state would have. There was not a whole lot of difference there. He would talk quietly to people. He would sit down and have coffee and cream and so on. So the strategic idea of invading the Soviet Union, communist Russia at the time, I think most people again would have probably made that decision. Now there are a few errors once that conflict began. There was certainly a view widely held inside the Nazi government there that the Soviet Union would collapse politically. And that didn't happen, although it wasn't an unreasonable assessment. Similarly, the Wehrmacht planners and strategists and tacticians had looked at the very inept job that the Red Army had done in invading Finland, the invasion of Eastern Poland, and they looked at that and thought, these guys are hopeless. They couldn't run a bath, let alone a war. So really, this idea that the Red Army could be defeated quickly, and that the Soviet Union was likely to collapse politically, I think they were reasonable given the times. Back then, it's easy after the event to say, that was a dumbass decision, but at the time, I think it was reasonable given the situation at the time. So now, the Wehrmacht planners underestimated the speed at which the Red Army could put new troops and equipment in the field, and they'd underassessed the amount of equipment that the Red Army had. That was a micro-strategic tactical blunder. But as the war went on for longer and the distances covered became greater, it was always going to be a tougher gig for the invading force, particularly given it was only 3 million or so guys. I mean, to cover it adequately, easily another 1 million troops would have been needed at the outset. So the intention of at the beginning of the war was to destroy the Soviet Red Army forces in and around the border, and between the border with Europe and, say, up to Smolensk. To destroy there. Now, what the Wehrmacht planners didn't see was how quickly that the Red Army could put new troops in the field, but how willing they were to sacrifice troops. So the idea that you'd put people in the front line after 2 weeks of training would be unthinkable to Wehrmacht planners. You just didn't do that sort of thing. But to the Red Army folks and the commissars, it was quite acceptable. If you stick 1 million guys in the middle of nowhere, the invading army still has to stop to deal with it. You can't have 1 million guys with rifles just roaming around unchecked in the rear areas. You've got to stop. You've got to deal with it. And the Wehrmacht never had enough troops to deal with the soldiers they're trying to capture, and to have enough troops to move decisively further into the interior. And really the Red Army was able to replace all its losses, plus some, far more quickly than the Wehrmacht planners had ever imagined. So now, whether you call that a strategic blunder, I don't know. Now, there were some strategy blunders where the Wehrmacht, Hitler included, decided that really by the time, particularly after the Battle of Vyazma Bryansk, heading towards Moscow in October 1941, after that battle, that the war was pretty much, it was over, it was done. I mean, sure, there may be some resistance and some diehard ideological fanatics that hang on, but really it was a done deal at that point. Now, that was clearly an assessment that was awry. And not that that view was held universally, by the way. There were those who thought, well, okay, why don't we dig in sort of October, November, the winter's coming, the rainy season's here, why don't we dig in, have a well-supplied front line, and then if the Red Army wants to tear themselves to pieces, charging the line that's well equipped and well dug in and well resourced, then fine, they can go ahead. Come summertime, we can recommence the mobile warfare and finish them off then. So there were multiple views there, and Hitler, strangely, didn't really make a decision one way or another, but decided to jump in, in December and try and demand that the soldiers are out in the frozen waste without resources should hold the line. So now the next strategic blunder, in my view, came again when the Wehrmacht looked like they were going to just finish the Red Army off in sort of the period June to August in 1942. And this is when they're advancing towards Stalingrad. Now, they were so convinced that the war again was over, that it's a done deal, the Red Army's finished, that they made the fateful decision to disperse the forces over a wide area and go chasing the oil down in the Caucasus Mountains around Baku and Maykop and down there, and also to clean up that Don River bend where Stalingrad was sort of part of that, and to take that and to interdict the supply lines coming up the Don River. Now, when they dispersed the force, they could have taken Stalingrad without a fight, but instead, when they dispersed the forces, they lost decisive striking power across a wide area, and then they found that the Red Army was in fact more numerous and better equipped than imagined, and so by the time they realised this and regrouped, and that it was too late. Stalingrad was already had a sizable force that was there, and then that everyone knows that turned into a battle and ultimately a disaster for the Wehrmacht. Now, even when Stalingrad was surrounded by the Red Army, the Wehrmacht still had sufficient striking power if they'd acted quickly to relieve the garrison. But there was a view that the Russians had just been defeated, had suffered a substantial defeat just to the south of Moscow, sort of towards the Voronezh area, and it suffered very heavy casualties there. And so the view with the Wehrmacht planners was, well, they've got nothing, they've got no gas left in the tank, they've shot their bolt. So this Stalingrad thing is sort of a bit of a storm in a teacup, and the local forces can handle it. And Hitler had even sent some of the panzer divisions on leave, so they were sunning themselves on French beaches. But had they gathered had they acted decisively and quickly on this, instead of seeing it as just some sort of local hiccup, the Stalingrad garrison could have been relieved, and the war could have taken a different turn there. So here's the tactical sort of micro-strategic tactical errors. Now, just going on to once the Allied landings occurred in North Africa, there's a view that the Wehrmacht should have quit North Africa. Hitler decided to make a political decision to make a fight out of it, and so ended up drawing off 500,000 well-equipped, well-trained troops that otherwise could have been deployed, perhaps decisively on the Russian front, opposing the Red Army. The Wehrmacht still had, as a total unit, still had sufficient striking power to defeat the Red Army. But once Hitler started dispersing the troops around, and then became fearful of possible invasions coming from Britain, along the French Normandy coastline, that more troops again were diverted. Now, the troops are in the European theatre on the on that seawall, as it's called, they weren't the best troops. So they were, guys in their 40s and 50s, people who'd had injuries from other battles, that sort of thing. So these weren't the prime troops, or not then anyway. So there was still striking power there, but it was over 500,000. I mean, close to 600,000 troops were deployed in Sicily, Italy, and North Africa that could have been used elsewhere. The Italian front did have to be defended, so there would have been troops needed to be deployed there. But those are the areas. Now, once that's come and the Battle of Kursk has taken place, really the initiative is taken out of the hands of the Wehrmacht, and they're fighting on too many fronts. They've got to man too many fronts, have too many areas covered. And at this point, no real grand strategy or anything's going to make a decisive difference. The forces arrayed against them in both men and material are just too vast to overcome. And so and Hitler sort of hoped that something like Frederick the Great's situation would occur, where the Russians, the British and the Americans, particularly the Russians falling out with the British and Americans, that would occur, and that would save Germany from invasion and defeat. But that was always a pipe dream. So again, just in summary, I don't think Hitler was better or worse than any of the others in grand strategy or even the micro strategy. And in tactics and micro strategy, he probably was better than a lot of the others. But that's how things unfolded, during World War II. But again, I don't think his concept of strategy or lack of it was a decisive factor in the end. You've been a Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.